Again in 1 Peter chapter 5. We looked at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 4 as we talked about Jesus functioning in that role as the chief shepherd. And now we're going to look at a few other verses. I have through 2a, but I think I'm probably just going to read verses 1 through 4. And we'll talk about all four of those because I think all of these to some extent are reflected in the nature of their oversight as shepherds. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker of the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. All right. Again, we discussed last week the idea of Jesus as chief shepherd. We might have a little bit of discussion about that again as we get to the end of this. Somebody that's behind the camera, does it look like it's streaming? Okay, because it hadn't popped there, it just now popped up. Makes me nervous when it takes that long to let me know that it's streaming because I don't know if it's streaming. All right, I exhort the elders among you. And I'm going to start off with making the observation that exercising oversight in verse 2. In some places you'll see the language overseers. Elders exercise oversight. So we know that elders and overseers are the same thing. Also, they're called shepherds in this context. We're not talking about different roles and different offices when we read overseers, when we read in the King James Version bishops. Some versions, I think, may use the word presbyter in certain places. But all of those are descriptives of the same office, giving us insight into what the nature of that office is and how it works. I exhort the elders among you. And Peter's, of course, writing by inspiration, but he lays forth some other justification for his right to discuss this and his experience as a fellow elder. And so he says, look, I have the same role that you do. I know this role because I've done it myself as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. So he's actually an eyewitness of the things that Jesus went through. Of course, we know that he was the Apostle Peter. That's what qualified him to be an apostle, was that he could go out and testify from an eyewitness standpoint to the resurrection. But he's reminding them of that, as well as a partaker in the glory that's going to be revealed. In other words, I'm a Christian who is an heir of the promises of the gospel. So he is relating to his audience, trying to help them understand that he is coming from the standpoint, he's not talking about an outside group. Hey, you need to be like this. He's including himself in that group. I'm a fellow elder. I'm also doing these things. I have all of this in common with you, so when I say what I'm about to say, I'm speaking to myself as well. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you. That's the first phrase. We've talked up to this point about the role of shepherding as it's presented in the Old Testament. We talked about Jesus functioning as the shepherd, which in the 4th verse, he's called the chief shepherd here. Now we're concentrating on these men who function as elders or overseers. And he said to shepherd the flock of God. What does that mean, to shepherd the flock of God? Okay. To lead them? Is that all? Okay. All that's good. Let's try a little bit to carry the imagery that the writer is using. So as shepherds, what do shepherds do? And partially what they do is lead. And they lead to specific things according to the 23rd Psalm. We're going to look at the 23rd Psalm in a minute. But they lead to where? To water and food. And so Christ identifies himself as the bread of life and the water of life, right? I'm the bread that came down out of heaven. What your fathers got in the wilderness, that wasn't the true bread. That's me, Jesus taught. And I am the water of life, or I bring you the water of life. All throughout the New Testament, and really all throughout the Bible, that imagery is used in connection with salvation through the Messiah. And so, if the shepherds lead to water and food, then the shepherds are leading people where? To Jesus. So that's the first thing you need to keep in mind, is the primary function of elders is to help people with, and I'm going to use this word generally, and then we're going to qualify it based upon what we're reading here, to help people find sustenance. But is that talking about physical sustenance or something else? It's talking about to find spiritual bread and spiritual water, which is in Christ. So the idea is for them to provide or lead or direct to the place where people gain spiritual life, to lead people to Jesus, to provide spiritual oversight. Not physical oversight, but spiritual oversight. To keep watch, and we're going to see this language in a minute, I think. I guess it's another context, so that's okay. To keep watch over people's safety from a physical standpoint. Is it the overseer's job to drive by everybody's houses throughout the week and make sure they're not being broken into and run off any burglars or people that are seeking to sneak in and harm your family at night? Is that their job? No, they're not sheriffs, are they? But they're what? They're to protect people's souls. To preserve them in what fashion? Well, making certain that they're feeding on the bread of life and not something else. Making certain that, not literally that they hadn't wandered away, but what? That their hearts haven't drifted away from God. Can someone be present in the assembly and still have drifted away from God? And so it's more than just being police over whether or not people attend, but it's making sure, more importantly, that what? That they're engaged. That their heart is where it needs to be. That their mind is on what it ought to be. That when they are present, that they are worshiping. That they are being spiritually fed. And that there are no grievous wolves, as they're called in some places, that have come in to devour us. Remember, David, watching his father's sheep, said that he fought off the bears and the lions and the wolves. That's what shepherds do. So in a spiritual application, who are these grievous wolves that creep in among us? Okay. Particularly, that language is used in the New Testament to talk about who? False teachers. Men who are denying the doctrines of God or who are introducing destructive heresies into the church. So it becomes the shepherd's duty to make sure that there aren't people in the church sowing seeds of discord or spreading immorality among the church or changing the doctrine of the gospel. Remember that epistle to the Galatians that talks about, I'm surprised that you so quickly deserted the gospel for another. And then he says what? Which is really not another, only some of you are doing what? you're twisting the gospel. And so it's not necessarily a completely different gospel. It's just altering the one that was delivered. That's just as bad. It becomes their job as overseers to protect against men who are doing such things and make certain that the flock is not harmed by those heresies, by those false doctrines. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you. What does that phrase mean? Okay. To a limit. Limit's the important word there. That is certainly a limiting statement. It qualifies it by limiting who you're shepherding. Who are they shepherding? Only those that are among you. Their duty isn't to some other place. If they go visiting somewhere, do they get to walk up to the local church and say, hey, I'm an elder back at so-and-so place, and so let me tell you, you need to stop doing this, and you need to do this differently, and this person needs to be admonished. Do they have that kind of authority? Absolutely not. Their authority to shepherd is limited only to a local flock. That flock that they are among, the group that they're a part of, and the group that has identified, and we're not going to be talking about their qualifications here, but the group that has identified that these men are in fact holding the qualities that the Holy Spirit set forth and that they have willingly submitted to. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion but willingly. Now this is the question, what does that qualify? Not under compulsion but willingly. I've actually heard some people suggest that that qualifies the overseer or the shepherd or the elder. That it can't be someone that you force into that position. It has to be someone who's willing to serve. I don't think that that's what's being qualified with those statements. I think oversight is being qualified. You don't oversee by compulsion, by trying to force, or by making demands. Instead, you oversee through willingness, through leadership, through perseverance. Shepherds, at least in their historic sense, don't drive the sheep places. They lead the sheep places. Do we understand the difference between those two things? Where do you drive from? Come on, everybody seen a Western? How do they move cattle? They go on a cattle drive. They drive them from where? From the back, and by force and compulsion, with whips. And in modern times, dogs, and electric prods, and all sorts of other things to force them to go to a place. Traditionally, that's not how shepherds lead flocks. How do shepherds lead flocks? They walk out in front and show the example of the path to take. This is where we need to go, and the sheep do what? They willingly follow. Because they trust the shepherd and know that he's leading them where? To green pastures. They want to go where he's going. Because they know that they're going to get their sustenance in that place, and they know that they're going to have protection along the way. And that's a very different mindset than the mindset that so often encroaches people in this kind of thing, in any kind of leadership position, by the way. This applies to more than just this one office, but we're focusing on this office right now. But listen, it makes a whole lot better leadership when you are exhibiting that you are working for their protection and their well-being, and they desire to do what you ask than the adversarial idea that exists in the business world in our nation. The idea that the employees are the adversaries of the suits, and that we're going to fight against each other to try to control things. That is not what's being described here. That is not why the language of shepherd is used to talk about this office. That's not why this idea of non-compulsory or willing type oversight is under consideration. You shouldn't have to force someone to do something. If the flock wants to go to Jesus and the shepherd is leading the way to Jesus, then what does the flock naturally do? Follow the shepherd. That they trust, that they have confidence in, that they know has their best interest at heart. Now remember, all of this discussion goes all the way back to where we started, which is the two great commandments are what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And the second one is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. From that, Jesus said, arises the whole law, which includes what we call the golden rule, which is what? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we talked about that at length. And that doesn't just mean that I treat you the way that I think you want me to treat you, but rather I treat you the way that I would want to be treated if I was in your position. If I was the one being talked to, if I was the one being corrected, if I was the one being led. And so that is controlling this idea right here. So if I'm overseeing, the question I need to be asking myself is, if I was answering to this kind of a relationship, if I was the one who is being overseen, how would I want them to treat me? And that dictates the best way to move forward for treating other people in such a position. And we talked about this at length, but I'll just bring it to your remembrance. We talked about it in the application of, let's say you're a teacher in a classroom. We'll even use a public school teacher or a college or university professor. That's even a better one. A college, well, actually, we'll use both of them because together they make a real powerful illustration. So if I'm a second grade teacher, how do I want my teacher to be toward me if I'm the second grader? I want them to love me. I want them to be nice. I want them to be sweet and kind. I want them to be helpful. And so when you were in second grade, did you have one of those teachers that was harsh and cold and bitter? I had one that was that way, and I had one that was the other way. I had a split class. I had one teacher that taught me science, and then one teacher that taught me the rest of the curriculum. And the science teacher was a lady that I don't know her background, I don't know her history, I don't know why she was that way, but she was just not a real nice person. She was harsh. I didn't like her. That's not how I wanted to be treated. I wanted someone who had respect for my questions and had respect for what I had to say. And would try to answer my questions. And instead I had a teacher that when I asked questions, they basically told me to shut up. It started one day when she was talking about dinosaurs and saying that they were around millions of years before men, and I raised my hand and I said, but I thought God made everything in 6 days. And she essentially told me to shut up. It was a hard question. It challenged the material that was being presented. It was asked from an honest, sincere position, but she had no respect for me. I was just a child to her, and my place was to be quiet and listen. When I got into college, did I expect my college professors to treat me differently than my second grade teacher treated me? Yeah, to some extent. I expected my college professors to respect the fact that I was what? An adult. And so it kind of frustrated me when I had college professors that took attendance and had attendance policies. I'm like, I'm not in second grade anymore. I'm not dealing with compulsory obligation to be here by law. I'm here by choice. Respect me to be intelligent enough to understand when I have something that comes up that I can't avoid and I have to miss class. And respect me enough to know that I'm going to do what I can to make up and to get the information that I need when I miss class. Don't fail me simply because I miss class, because if I learn all the material, why should I fail? If I work just as hard as everybody else, why should I? When I was in second grade, I didn't have the right to expect that from someone because I wasn't, well, by the time I graduated college, I was 24, so. We those dynamics change somewhat depending on the circumstances. And we understand that when we are in the position of having people oversee us. And what the Golden Rule is suggesting is that when I'm in the position of being the one in authority, I need to consider the position that I am exercising authority over and use my authority in the way that is in their best interest rather than my own. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, we got to be careful. We have to be really careful about such things. It again, a lot of things come into play in those kinds of things. A lot of judgments come into play. We're talking about the underlying attitude, because this is instruction to the elder about how to use the authority that God has granted them. And notice that right after it says, don't exercise oversight by compulsion. Don't try to force people to do things. The next phrase is, as God would have you. So he underscores the fact that this isn't his instruction about how to use this authority. This is God's instruction about how to use this authority. By the way, God has exemplified this type of leadership in the person of Jesus while he was on the earth. That's why we studied Jesus as the shepherd before we got here. Did Jesus go around using his divine power to compel people to do things? Or did he share with them the message and allow them to choose to follow him? How many times did he say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear? Jesus is the preeminent example of not compelling people, but leading people, directing people, providing guidance for people. So much so that he actually said that I came not to judge. Now, he's going to judge one day, but that's not why he came to the earth. He came to the earth to seek and save those who are lost. How did he do that? by living as an example for you to follow in His steps, by calling people to repentance, by showing them what righteousness looks like, and by allowing them to choose to come and follow. That is the epitome of what it means to exercise oversight without compulsion, or not under compulsion as it's worded here. Willingly, as God would have you to do it. Then he says, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Shameful gain means that, as I understand it in this context, simply means that I'm not to be doing this job for what I can get out of it. If I accept this work because I think it's going to put me in a special position, or because I think it's going to make something easier for me, or because I think I can use people to accomplish my ends, then I'm doing it for the wrong reason. I'm doing it for my shameful gain, rather than doing it because I'm eager to do what? Serve others. Encourage. See people led to good food and good water. See people helped. See people lifted out of the ditch. See that I defend them from those who would harm them. Those are all the work of the shepherd. The shepherd doesn't serve himself. The shepherd serves the flock, the interest of the flock, the needs of the flock. So I don't do this for shameful gain, not domineering those in your charge. Now, see, that's the second time he's mentioned that right here in the same context, essentially. Not domineering is extremely similar to not under compulsion. Not controlling. Not demanding. Not using the position to say, hey, I'm the boss and you do what I tell you to do. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples. Showing the way. Showing them what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. Showing them what it looks like to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Showing them what it looks like to be apt to teach. Showing them what it looks like to be a good husband and a good father. Showing what it looks like to be a faithful servant of God. Providing the example that when they see it, if they're desiring a relationship with God, they say, I need that kind of relationship with God. Seeing a man who is prayerful and humble and quiet and realizing, if I'm to be a follower of Jesus, I've got to look like that rather than trying to demand and control and exercise authority the way that the world exercises authority. And the contrast, I guess, we'll go to the extreme, the very far extreme. You remember Nebuchadnezzar when he dealt with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Particularly when he dealt with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the time when he set up that golden image and demanded that when the musicians play that everyone must bow down and worship. Or else, under penalty of law, they would be cast into a fiery furnace. You do what I say or I'm going to burn you to death. That's ruling under compulsion. Saying to someone, look, we need to do this because this is right, and I'm going to show you how to do it by living that way myself. That's the contrast. Being understanding. Being a Nehemiah kind of leader. Where Nehemiah said, hey, wait a minute, I know I have a right to a food allowance, but not only am I not going to take my food allowance, but I'm going to use my own money to feed you. And so he had a right by law to take money to feed himself. And not only did he not do that, but he also shared what he already had with other people to show what it looks like to be a caring and sharing person. That's shepherd leadership. By the way, how successful was Nehemiah in his leadership? 50-something days they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem? Why did they build the walls of Jerusalem so quickly under Nehemiah's leadership? Because those people willingly followed. They had a mind to work. And the reason they had a mind to work is because they had respect for Nehemiah. They knew that Nehemiah was an honest and good man who had their interest at heart, was doing what they needed and not serving himself. And so when he said, this is what we need to do, they did it. Yes, sir. He was talking about take compensation for his preaching. He had a right to take it, but he didn't take it from everyone. In fact, the language he used was, I robbed from other churches to serve you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Right. Sure. We ought to. We certainly ought to respect those efforts. I'm not sure we always do. But we ought to. Now, the next thing I want you to notice about this is verse 4. Verse 4 is an important verse for a couple of reasons. When the chief shepherd appeared, stop. Important thing number 1. Who's in charge? Not the elders among us, but Jesus. He's the chief. He's the one in charge. Those men should be working for Jesus. Now, do you remember the Roman centurion who had a servant at home that was sick? And he went to Jesus and sought help. And Jesus says, sure, let's go to your house. You remember what the Roman centurion said? He said, yeah, don't do that. I'm not worthy to have you in my house. He knew and understood that if Jesus had stepped foot in his house, that would have made Jesus what? Unclean as far as the Jewish law was concerned. So he said, no, I'm not worthy to have you under my roof. And then he said something else even more important and more impressive. He said, look, I understand authority. I have people who are under me, and they do exactly what I tell them to do. But I also have people who are over me, and when they tell me to do something, I do it. So I know all you have to do is say the word, and it will be done. And what was Jesus' response to that? I've not seen such great faith in all of Israel. Grasping this idea. Now this was a Roman centurion. This man commanded a Roman century, 100 men. And a lot of them were arrogant and boastful about such a position. It's like the story I heard one time about a fellow that went to work for Walmart as a greeter. He did a great job when he was there, but he had a bad habit of getting there late. And his boss corrected him a couple of times, and his boss called him into the office and said, I don't know what you did in your last job, but I can't imagine that your boss let you be late like this all the time. He said, well, in my last job, I was a general, so I could show up whenever I wanted to. That's the mindset of a lot of people in leadership. When they're the boss, nobody can tell me what to do. I can do what I want to do. But this Roman centurion didn't have that attitude. Instead, he recognized that he had people yet over him. That's exactly what overseers ought to remember is, wait a minute, we're not the chief. We got someone directing us and telling us what to do. We are simply carrying out instructions. We're the unprofitable servant who's only doing what we've been told to do. Yes, sir. Right. You don't answer to me, you answer to Jesus. There's one chief. And by the way, Paul points that out, in the letter to the Ephesian church. Jesus is the head. There's not a whole bunch of heads. There's one head and a whole bunch of body parts. And among those body parts are prophets and apostles and elders and teachers and preachers. But one head that we all answer to, that has all authority, and we know that he has all authority because he said what? All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And so Jesus is the one that's in charge. When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. The second point that I'd make from this verse is the one that I think is very often overlooked. Ultimately, if I am in this role at any point in time in my life, if I should fall in the role of functioning as an elder, I need to understand that my reward will not necessarily come in time. When will my reward come? When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. My reward ultimately is spiritual, and it has to do with fulfilling my obligations, serving Christ in the capacity that I'm qualified to serve, and I should be satisfied knowing that when he returns, I'll be rewarded for that. I shouldn't need anything else. And that's an important lesson because it tells me, it goes back to not for shameful gain. It's a contrast to shameful gain. Rather than doing it for something that I can gain in time, I do it as a servant of Christ. And I wait for him to exalt me at the proper time. I don't have to exalt myself. By the way, he actually told us that, didn't he? Not to exalt ourselves, but to wait, and he'll exalt us at the proper time. And so it speaks to the nature of the work that we do. And this applies to fathers. It applies to husbands. You brought up again the idea that elders are to shepherd the flock of God which is among them, and they don't have authority over anybody else. Husbands are the same way. Husbands have authority where? In their home over their wife. I don't get to go talk to somebody else's wife and say, this is what you should do. I don't have authority over anybody else's wife. By the way, I don't want it. Doing it good with one person is hard enough. Providing and preserving and protecting and seeing that she's taken care of and fed properly and protected, that's a full-time job. I don't know why anybody would want to be a bigamist. I have hard enough time taking care of one. And I may not do it all the time too well. You can talk to her and ask about that. I mean, it's not easy. But these same things apply in that relationship as well. Not to exercise my authority abusively and controllingly, but rather to behave toward her, as Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, the way Christ did toward the church. And the example he gives for that he gave himself up for it. He sacrificed himself for the well-being of the church. And husbands ought to do the same thing for their wives. That's using the authority to benefit the one whose charge you have, rather than using your charge to benefit yourself. And this is the consistent image set forth in the Scriptures over and over and over again. And it's said in this context that this is the way God would have it done, and that if you do it this way, when the Lord returns, He will give you the unfading crown of glory if you do it this way. What if you don't do it that way? What if you domineer and you try to compel people to do things and you act opposite of the characteristics that are conveyed here? What's going to happen when the chief shepherd appears? You just stick the word "not" in that sentence. When the chief shepherd appears, you will not receive the unfading crown of glory, because you're not doing it as God would have you. And you're supposed to be God's servants. You're not God's yourself. All right, I got to stop. Appreciate those that are here and that made comments. Appreciate those that have watched online. I hope that this has been beneficial. It's just a beginning. We got a couple more passages to look at. We're going to go back to Psalm 23 next week and look at it this time, instead of from the perspective of how it's describing Jesus, talk about it from the perspective of how it is describing elders or overseers in their work.